Everyone, welcome to this AISMA Finance Clinic in collaboration with Practice Index. I'm James Gransby, Vice Chair of AISMA, and I'm joined today by Abby and Andrew. You can find out more about us in the show notes. And today we're looking at why some GP practices are more profitable than others, and importantly, why they're still able to maintain high standards of patient care at the same time. So first off, looking at profits, taking it back to its bare minimum, profits are income minus expenses. So for want of a better place to start, should we start with income and hear your thoughts on that, Andrew and Abby, in the context of high profits, i.e. what are the most profitable practices doing differently from each other in terms of income? Over to you guys. Okay,
Abby, do you want to go first or do you want me to?
I'm more than happy to go first here. So it's a very interesting question. You know, what distinguishes the higher earning and more profitable practices than others? Obviously, there is a work-life balance here. You can have some practices where the partners will go out and do all sorts of extra work. We're not really talking about that today because you know that's something that they usually keep themselves, have as a pre-share. We're talking about really what two similar practices are doing and why one would be more profitable than the other. The subject here is huge. There are all sorts of things we can talk about, but in my mind, you know, it comes down to being organised, being methodical. You're looking at the income that you're earning and making sure you're paid for it. You're looking at income that you've claimed and making sure that comes in, and you're just generally making sure that the partners are being paid for what they're doing and looking at the best overall strategy, making sure that you're comparing what you think you should be receiving to what you're actually getting. Because in a lot of cases, for those more profitable practices, that's where they're looking at the finer detail and making sure that, you know, where they're getting the income streams and they know what they're getting, they're comparing it, they're making sure that what they're getting is what they expect.
Yeah, and just to follow on from that, I think it's critical to remember that money still follows the patient in general practice. So as far as GMS contract is concerned, from 1st of April this year, the rates actually increased to £96.78 per weighted patient. You've also got the other ancillary parts as well. So all of your enhanced services, your QOF income, it's all patient number driven. So absolutely look at your patient numbers. If there is scope to increase patient numbers without taking on an additional workload or too much additional workload, then that's really important. If it's a case that every new patient that comes through the door is one with huge health problems, they present to the practice several times in a year, then you've got to weigh that up against the actual resource that you employ and also the doctor's time as well. So whilst money does follow the patient, it's that work-life balance, as Abby mentioned previously.
Yeah. And that's a great point, Andrew. And also, you know, when you're looking at new services, there are certain things you can take on a new service, but often the practice will look at the income, the pounds that are going to come from that new service, but they don't necessarily take account of the cost that's involved. You know, you've got to look at the cost versus the benefit and make sure you're looking at that, not only in terms of the hard costs where you're having to pay out for things, but also in terms of partner time as well. So there's a lot in the mix there to consider, and it is, you know, it's very difficult. And I don't envy the job of practice managers helping to balance everything out.
And Abby, would you extend that to the QOF as well in terms of, you know, pounds per effort, in terms of costs that incurs and stuff? Should they chase every QOF point, or are there some you should just let go?
No, I think, you know, that again is an excellent point, James. You know, there are some that are more easy to gain than others. That, you know, delegation is key. You know, there's some, not just for QOF, but for some of the other income streams. You know, you can delegate down. You can use healthcare assistance, for example, rather than partner time. And also, you know, we're not looking at expenses quite yet, but again, it's looking at that effort. How much effort do you need to put in to get those final points? Sometimes it just isn't worth it, or if it doesn't, you know, fit in, it isn't. You need to look and break down, and that's as an AISMA accountant, that's what I do. You break down each of the income streams, each of the expenses, and you're looking and saying, you know, how does that balance? Is it comparable to other profitable practices? Is there more effort here that would benefit you, but does the effort make sense, and is it going to be worthwhile?
And whilst we're still talking about income as well, you can extend that approach to every other source of income outside of your core contract as well. So whilst on paper, it might be nice to see a research project coming in, for example, which can boost practice profits, you've got to balance that with the time and effort and costs incurred to generate that income. It may not be worth it. Having said that, you could have the flip side whereby the actual project, if it is a research project, you've got somebody within the practice that really enjoys that aspect. So giving them the variety of work as well. We know from seeing patients, if all you see day in, day out are patients with health problems, repeat consultations, it must be incredibly challenging to see a lot of what they call, I guess, heart sink patients. So having something outside of the humdrum of day-to-day pressures of general practice, there's a lot to be said for that as well.
Most definitely. And I think the other thing that leads on from that, Andrew, is that sometimes practices don't want to cover with locums for certain sessions, but if one of the partners is able to do something a bit more interesting or profitable, it would make more sense, to bring in that locum, cover those sessions to free the partner up to do that more lucrative work. Obviously, you don't want too much of that. The patients obviously hugely value their relationship with their regular partner doctor, and often, you want to keep that continuity. It's not necessarily, but certain things, say joint injections or certain clinics where it's a more specialised thing, it isn't necessarily the best thing to not cover those sessions with a locum to free the GP partner up.
Thanks, Abby. So being selective around which income you choose to go for, and just making sure that you manage those costs as well, which brings us on to costs. Actually, you mentioned locum costs and things there. Like I say, profits are made up of two components, aren't they? Income and expenses. Thoughts on costs and how they're best managed in the most profitable practices. Abby,
so, Andrew, did you want to kick off on this one?
I can have a go. Yeah, so biggest practice cost is clearly your staff costs. So it's really important that you look at the staff mix. I think one takeaway I would take away today, if nothing else, is that general practice is a business like any other business. Yes, you get the recurring funding as part of your core contract, but you have to view it as a business. And the staff that you employ will all be contributing to the delivery of the services that you are required to do. I think more than anything now, given the resource issues with GPs, given how pressured general practice is, it's looking at who sees the patients, what categories of staff see them. It doesn't have to be necessarily a GP. That lends itself to, or takes us on to, funding coming through your primary care networks and the additional role reimbursements. That has been ramped up from 1st of April this year. There are a number of additional roles that can be funded through that scheme. So talking about mental health practitioners, clinical pharmacists, physiotherapists, the list goes on. In the words of NHS England, and you'll see this on the contract pages as well, this is a critical year for PCNs to make best use of the ARRS funding. So I think you've got to be in it to win it, as someone famously once said. And it's making best use of that resource that is available to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Often, if I look at a individual practice client, they won't necessarily have systems in place for the staff mix. Overtime is a very good thing to control. I had a practice where we found that some of the staff in the afternoon were doing overtime in the evening, doing all the work, and then the staff in the morning came in with nothing to do. And it was a perpetual cycle. So, it's systemizing, it's making sure that you're looking at who is doing what can be done better, what can be done by who. It's a huge area. Generally on expenses, you can break it down into a number of things. There are certain expenses, like, for example, repairs, where you're going to spend it, yes, get value for money, but there's not a lot you can do to save on there, and keeping the property in good repair, but you've got that. There are other expenses like insurances where you can shop around, and it's always a good idea to shop around, but don't get bogged down. And often you need to make sure, cost isn't everything. You need to get value for what you're spending. So with the insurance side of things, the more important thing is the cover. don't skimp, make sure you've got the cover, because the partners will be relying on you to ensure that if something happens and you need to have that insurance claim, you're covered. So it's not all about pulling back on cost.
I was just going to ask, are there any certain costs that you see getting out of control sometimes? I mean, what's the easiest one to sort of go off on a tangent and skyrocket?
Well, printing and stationery. I had a practice where we talked to them about printing and stationery for years and years, and they finally last year they did something about it. They saved £25,000 off their printing and stationery bill. Even I was gobsmacked at that level. But it is, and it's educating the team. You can do print audits, so you can see who is printing too much. Can you PDF items? The ink cartridges are a huge cost. So things like printing and stationery. Generally, the utilities, it's just a matter. What I suggest is that you put a diary note in. At the end of the contract, when the contract's going to put a diary note in and remember, and then you can check it. So that's probably a big area. I think probably generally you need to be focusing and focus on one or two areas. Often, you're so busy, but I know practice managers are run off their feet and have interruptions and staffing and everything to deal with. But it works a lot better. Focus on something, say printing and stationery or the telephone contracts, and action it. It's easy to say, oh yes, our costs, we need to look at things, but unless you actually pinpoint something to actively follow up on, it tends to not happen, and it just kind of carries on, and before you know it, you're 2 years later down the line and you haven't really got round to looking at it. So I would say, a good practical aspect for that is to actually plan a systematic review. But if you're with an AISMA accountant, you should be, when you go through the practice accounts, you look line by line, and you can see on there, not only can you see where things have gone up, where they perhaps shouldn't have done, but you can also benchmark and look at other practices. So you can say, hang on, why is our practice spending X amount on printing and stationery when all these other practices are managing to do that at a lot lower level? And there will be reasons behind it. It's just a matter of taking the time to go through, check what's happening, and see why your spend is higher. And that's the point at which you want to be distinguishing between those costs that are going to make a material difference, those that you can tweak a little bit but don't spend too much time on.
And Andrew, have you got thoughts around benchmarking?
Well, before we get to that, can I just pick up on another couple of costs which, in my experience, do tend to potentially go out of control? So the first one is postage. The cost of a first-class stamp now is more expensive than it's ever been. And I think practices have the opportunity to make better use of technology. So SMS messaging, for example, to get communications out to patients is it's a far more effective way of doing it. The other ones, medical consumable costs, occasionally they get out of control, and that tends to be where you've got more than one person dealing with the ordering and stock control. So that's something to bear in mind as well. And then finally, drugs. It's looking at the level of drugs that the practice is holding, particularly those dispensing practices, because there is obviously a possibility of obsolescence. So keeping an eye on those ones as well is really important. So moving on to your question about benchmarking, AISMA members all have access to data for the country, which can be drilled into more local regions. It can be looked at on a national basis as well. That's one of the beauty of using an AISMA member, is the fact that they have access to this data and can benchmark your practice performance against others, not only in your locality, but across the country as well. So it's looking at profit per patient, income per patient, expenses per patient, and breaking it down. And there will always be differentials because no two practices operate the same, but you can get a good feel for where there are areas where perhaps you are a bit out of sync with others, and then you can address them accordingly.
And I guess the power of the benchmarking will be then to look to see what can be changed in the future, which then leads into, I guess, talking about budgeting and cash flowing, because if you've got one of the more profitable practices, it probably didn't happen by accident, it was by design. So just thoughts around budgeting and particularly around, setting expectations for that year and monitoring it. How often would you look at it? Every month, or would you look at it every quarter? Thoughts around budgeting.
even with our clients, you know, you do struggle with some of them to get them in the habit of budgeting and looking forward. But it is vital. You know, you are looking at what's happened. The accounts, when we meet with them, you know, that's what's happened. But it is looking forward, seeing what you can change, seeing what you can do going forward. It is absolutely crucial. So you know, you need to plan for things. You know, if you think you know, it's not only an opportunity to look forward in terms of where your income's going, but also to make changes and tweak what's happening so that you can see exactly what's on the horizon and deal with it as you go. You know, the most profitable practices will have a really robust accounting system, and that will help them budget as well, because they'll have good detailed information. They'll be able to plan forward. They'll look at individual streams of income and expenses. You know, they can use that data, and their accountant can use the data, the good quality data they've got, to flow things forward and, you know, preempt problems as they go. Generally, we would suggest probably a quarterly review with your accountant, but you can have, you know, on Xero, for example, which is a great system for practices. You know, you can have a monthly a system where you've got monthly budget figures to compare to actual. And again, coming back to what I was saying at the beginning, absolutely vital. You need to know, what are you expecting and how does it compare against actual? And if you've got a system that can flag that up at the time it happens, you know, and then you can do something about it, it's so much better. You know, generally, even with AISMA accountants, if you haven't got a sort of in-year review process, you know, by the time we get to look at the accounts, that's going to be some long time after the practice year end. And, you know, not everything that we pick up can be retrospectively claimed, for example.
And Andrew, thoughts around budgets and how you manage those?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it probably needs to be extended further. So one of the things that we always focus on is practice cash flow. So it's really important that practices do monitor and control both income and expenses on a regular basis. Cash is king. That's always the case. And whilst cash does give you an indication of how well the business is performing, you do need to have a proper handle on it to make sure that all the claims and all of the income streams that you are entitled to are actually received. And that then links into working capital requirements for the practice as well, because the individual partners, especially when partner numbers are dwindling as well, it puts more and more pressure on them individually to provide the working capital that the practice needs on a day-to-day basis. So having those controls in place, making sure that payments are made promptly, making best use of your credit terms, and having an eye on the future as well in terms of knowing where you are profitability-wise, it's really important. Ideally, you don't want to be in a situation whereby the partners do not know what practice profitability looks like until the accounts are prepared. The systems now are in place. The products such as Xero that Abby mentioned, they are far more advanced than what's ever been available in the past. So absolutely, you need to get systems in place to enable you to have those controls, and your AISMA accountant will be able to guide you every step of the way on that.
But I think also, you know, the emphasis is not just on the practice manager. You know, it's not the practice manager's business; it's the partner's business. And the most profitable practices are where the partners or a designated finance partner and practice manager are both working with their accountant. So you've got a good flow of information between them all. Rather than, you know, just leave the practice manager to sort of get on with it. And, you know, and often, you know, you bat things in the office, you know, you bat things together. Oh, that looks a bit odd. That's because this, that's because that, you know, you need that flow between you. So in my mind, you know, for the practices to work on the most profitable level, you need to have partners that are interested in the finances, realize that they're running a business, and most usually have a designated finance partner that understands that bit more and can really work as a double act with the practice manager, be it a finance practice manager or general practice manager, to understand what's going on.
Thanks, Abby. This is a topic we've sort of just scratched the surface, as it were, but we're sort of coming up to an end of our allotted time now. So just to think about on reflections and some wrapping up, what I've taken from this afternoon has really been, don't chase every income point if you don't need to. You know, be selective around that, manage those costs. Really great examples there on printed, postage, stationery and telephone, because none of that would dilute patient care as such. I mean, moving to text messages may actually be advantageous to some patients. They may prefer it that way, for example. But just to leave us with a couple of thoughts, takeaways, 2 or 3 tips for practices when they're looking at their profitability. Did you want to go first, Abby?
Yes, my buzzword is always expectation. You know, what are you expecting? And is that's what's happened? And if it isn't, investigate and systemize the general terms. But if you get those principles in place, you can apply them to everything. You know, you can delegate, you can put systems in place. For example, on drugs, as Andrew was talking about, you know, have you got a system on that? You can hugely improve profitability on drugs by having the right systems in place. You might not know what systems you need, and at that point you can start to speak to an accountant that specialises in the medical professional, and they can help you. There's plenty of help out there. It's just making, you know, just taking advantage of that. But yeah, expectations and systems.
Thanks, Abby. And your couple of 2 or 3 points, Andrew?
Yes, of course. So outside of your core contract, only do work which is profitable for you. Yes, it's nice to increase income, but you have to weigh up, is it worth it in terms of the overall contribution to a business as a whole? Abby mentioned quaff points and whether it's worth chasing every last point. I think the agreement between us all is no, don't chase every last point. You've got to look at income versus, or risk versus reward at the end of the day. And also look at staff costs. They are your biggest expense. You want to ensure that you have a happy, healthy, vibrant team that's doing the right work at the right levels. If there's opportunities to spread the load, then absolutely. Yeah, those are my 3. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Abby. And thank you, Andrew. This has been the AISMA Finance Clinic in collaboration with Practice Index. Today, we've been looking at why some GP practices are more profitable than others. If you've got any queries or comments, please just get in contact. Our contact details will be in the notes, or leave them in the forum. And we look forward to seeing you again for another topic soon.